Somewhere in Southeast Asia right now, a child is getting their hair brushed by a mother who keeps saying the same thing every other mother in the neighborhood says. Stop fighting it. Just tie it back. Why can't it be straight like everyone else's? For generations, curly hair in this part of the world has been treated like a puzzle piece that doesn't belong. People blamed a Spanish sailor from 300 years ago. They blamed a Portuguese trader nobody could actually name. They blamed an American soldier, a Dutch merchant, anyone foreign, anyone from outside the family tree. The explanation was always the same. Somewhere back there, an outsider must have married in, and that's why the hair curls. Modern genetics says otherwise, and what it says is bigger and stranger than anyone expected. Curly hair across Filipino, Malaysian, Indonesian, Thai, Burmese, and Cambodian populations isn't a foreign leftover. It isn't proof of mixing with Europeans or Africans centuries ago. It's the opposite. It's older than almost anything else about these societies. Older than the languages spoken there today, older than the religions practiced there, older than the kingdoms and colonies that came and went. To understand why, we have to go back to a version of the map that doesn't exist anymore, to a time before Asia looked anything like it does now. For most of the 20th century, the accepted version of human history was tidy. Humans evolved in Africa, left around 60 to 70,000 years ago, and fanned out in a few big branches. One branch went toward Europe, one went toward East Asia, one eventually crossed into the Americas. Each branch supposedly settled into its own look, its own skin tone, its own hair type. East Asia, in this old model, was straight black hair from the very beginning. No exceptions, no complications. So when someone from the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia showed up with curls, the assumption followed automatically. It had to be foreign blood. It had to be recent. Nobody considered that it might be ancient, that it might actually predate everything else about the region. That assumption started falling apart once scientists began sequencing DNA from a set of communities scattered across South and Southeast Asia, known collectively, somewhat clumsily, as the Negritos. The word itself comes from Spanish colonizers and just means small, dark-skinned people, a label imposed from the outside rather than a name any of these communities chose for themselves. Under that umbrella sit distinct peoples with their own names, their own languages, their own histories. The Agta and Aita of the Philippines, the Batak of Palawan, the Mamanwa of Mindanao, the Jahais and Semang of Malaysia, the Manik of southern Thailand, a community numbering only a few hundred people today. The Andamanese Islanders of the Indian Ocean, including the isolated Sentinelese, who remain almost entirely uncontacted by the outside world. These groups don't have much in common culturally or linguistically. What they share is biological. Dark skin, small compact bodies, and hair that grows in tight curls or spirals, sometimes ringlets, sometimes something close to an afro texture. For a long time, researchers assumed this meant these populations were somehow leftover Africans, isolated descendants of a group that had wandered improbably far from home and just never mixed with anyone else. Dark skin plus curly hair equaled African ancestry. That was the whole theory. Then the genome sequencing came back, and it wiped that theory out completely. These populations are not recently African. They're not displaced Africans who happen to end up in the rainforests of Southeast Asia. They are genetically some of the oldest Asian populations on the planet. They trace back to the very first wave of modern humans who left Africa, not toward Europe, not toward the cold plains of the north, but along the coastline, following the shore east through what's now Yemen, Oman, Iran, Pakistan, India, and onward into the tropics. Researchers call this the coastal migration, sometimes the southern dispersal route, and it appears to have happened around 60 to 70,000 years ago, potentially before the migrations that eventually populated Europe and northern Asia. Picture the logic of that walk. You're moving along warm coastlines where the ocean provides food. You don't have to hunt down shellfish and fish and tidal pools full of something to eat every single day. The sun overhead is brutal and constant, nothing like the filtered light of higher latitudes. Under those conditions, certain traits simply work better than others. Darker skin protects against relentless ultraviolet exposure. Smaller body frames shed heat more efficiently. And tightly curled hair, it turns out, does something straight hair can't. It lifts away from the scalp and traps a cushion of air, insulating the head from direct sun in a way that flat, straight hair never could. It's not decoration. It's climate engineering built into the follicle. The same pressures produce the same solution in completely unconnected populations. Equatorial Africa, Melanesia, New Guinea, parts of maritime Southeast Asia. None of these groups needed to be closely related for this to happen, because it isn't really about shared ancestry at that point. It's convergent evolution, different populations independently arriving at the same biological answer because they were facing the same environmental problem. Now stretch that coastal walk out across thousands of years and thousands of miles, down through the Arabian coast, along the edge of the Indian subcontinent, through the mangroves near what's now Bangladesh, along the shores of Burma and Thailand, and eventually into a landmass that doesn't exist anymore in the way it did then. During the Ice Age, sea levels sat more than 100 meters lower than today, which meant Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the islands that would become the Philippines weren't separate islands at all. They were high ground, connected into one enormous continental shelf that researchers now call Sundaland. Someone could have walked from southern India most of the way to what's now Bali without ever needing a boat. It was only later, as the ice melted and the seas rose over thousands of years, that this single landmass fractured into the scattered archipelagos we know today, and the people living across it were cut off from one another, isolated on islands that used to be hillsides. Flood narratives passed down through indigenous oral traditions, from Australia to the Philippines, may be distant cultural echoes of exactly this transformation. The people who made that original coastal walk didn't disappear. They settled. They became the ancestors of the Agta, the Aita, the Andamanese, the Jahai, dozens of communities that still exist today, holding some of the oldest human DNA found anywhere outside Africa. When geneticists build family trees comparing these groups to East Asians, Europeans, and indigenous Americans, the Negrito populations don't sit as a late branch or an odd offshoot. They sit near the root. They were already there. Everyone else arrived afterward and built on top of what already existed. This is where the story stops being abstract and starts being personal for a huge portion of Southeast Asia's population. If your background traces to the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, or nearby regions, there's a strong chance a measurable percentage of your ancestry connects back to this original wave. Genome-wide studies of Filipino populations, including large-scale work mapping over 1,000 individuals across the archipelago, found traces of Negrito ancestry almost everywhere, from small percentages in lowland urban populations to well over 20% in some highland and rural communities, with certain groups in the Cordillera region showing even higher proportions. The Filipino genome, in other words, isn't one thing. It's layered, built up over at least 5 distinct waves of migration stacked on top of each other like sediment. The deepest layer, the foundation everything else sits on, belongs to the Aita and their relatives. Above that sits the Austronesian farming migration that arrived from Taiwan roughly 4,000 years ago. Above that, traders moving through Borneo and Sulawesi. Above that, merchants connected to South Asian trade networks. And on top of all of it, the more recent and more documented arrivals. Chinese traders, Spanish colonizers, American administrators. Every layer added something. But the base layer, the oldest layer, was already there long before any of it. The pattern repeats across the region. In Malaysia, the Semong and Senoi populations contributed ancestry that still surfaces in modern Malay genomes. In Indonesia, especially in the eastern islands, ancestry connected to Papuan and Negrito populations runs deep. Traces show up in parts of southern Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, even reaching into southern China and southern India. Everywhere the coastal migration passed through, it left a signature, and that signature still shows up today in skin tone, in facial structure, and most visibly in hair. So when someone of Filipino, Malaysian, or Indonesian descent is born with curls instead of the straight hair considered typical for the region, that isn't a foreign trait breaking through. It's the opposite. It's the older trait breaking through, resurfacing from a layer of ancestry that predates almost every other part of the region's identity. It is, quite literally, the hair of the people who arrived first. The genetics behind this are becoming well understood. Hair texture is shaped by multiple genes working together, but 2 in particular matter most for this story. One is TCHH, short for trichohyalin, which produces a protein involved in shaping the internal structure of each hair strand, directly influencing whether hair grows straight, wavy, or curled. The other is EDAR, short for ectodysplasmin A receptor, and this one has a particularly interesting variant known as 370EA. This version of the gene is extremely common across East Asia and the Americas, and it produces thicker, straighter hair strands, along with more sweat glands, and a distinctive tooth shape called shovel-shaped incisors. It likely arose somewhere in Northeast Asia around 30,000 years ago, and then spread rapidly as populations moved south and east, eventually crossing into the Americas. Here's the key detail. Negrito populations largely don't carry high frequencies of this East Asian EDAR variant. Instead, they carry older gene variants, the kind found in South Asian populations, in some African populations, and in ancient human genomes generally. Their hair texture runs on a different genetic system entirely. When that older system mixes with the newer East Asian variant through generations of intermarriage and migration, the result is often exactly what you see across huge stretches of Southeast Asia today. Hair that isn't quite straight and isn't quite tightly curled, skin tone that sits somewhere between categories, features that resist easy classification. Genetically speaking, it's a meeting point between 2 ancient lineages, the first wave that walked the southern coast and the later wave that came down from the north. There's another layer to this story that makes it stranger still. Some of these same populations, particularly certain groups in the Philippines, carry unusually high amounts of Denisovan ancestry. Denisovans were an archaic human species, cousins to Neanderthals, who lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually disappearing as a distinct lineage. Before they vanished, they interbred with the modern humans moving through the region. Most people of East Asian descent today carry a small trace of Denisovan DNA, typically under 1%. Certain Philippine populations carry roughly 5%. Populations in New Guinea carry somewhere between 4 and 6%. These numbers represent some of the highest documented Denisovan ancestry anywhere on Earth. Think about what that actually means. It means that as those first coastal travelers moved east, they didn't just settle and keep their curly hair. At some point, they encountered another kind of human entirely, a separate lineage that had already been living in Asia for an immense stretch of time, and they had children together. Those children's descendants are alive today, living in mountain communities and forest villages across the region, carrying more genetic material from an extinct human species than almost anyone else on the planet. Some of these ancient gene variants appear linked to immune function and adaptation to tropical disease environments, quietly shaping biology in ways still being studied. There's no monument marking that meeting between two human species, no written record, no oral epic passed down about it. It just exists quietly, encoded in the DNA of people going about ordinary life in ordinary towns, completely unaware of what they're carrying. None of this erases the harder parts of the story, and they deserve to be said plainly. The communities carrying this ancient ancestry have paid a heavy price for their history, displaced repeatedly from ancestral land as farming populations expanded, enslaved during periods of Spanish and other colonial control, pushed further into mountains and forests generation after generation, treated as outsiders and inferiors by neighboring populations who, without realizing it, shared enormous amounts of their DNA. In the Philippines, many Aita communities still live with limited access to resources and recognition. In Malaysia, Semang and Sonoy communities face comparable challenges. In the Andaman Islands, some Negrito groups have been reduced to a few dozen or a few hundred individuals, standing at the edge of disappearing entirely within a generation or two. That's what makes this genetic story more than trivia. If your curly or wavy hair connects back to these populations, it isn't just an interesting fact for a comment section. It's a reminder of who was there first, who endured centuries of displacement, and who is still holding on, often just barely. There's a shift happening, slowly, in how these communities are talked about. Filipino researchers and writers have started pushing back against old colonial framing that painted Negrito populations as primitive outsiders on the margins of society, arguing instead that they represent the foundation the entire archipelago's population is built on top of. Similar conversations are unfolding in Malaysia around Orang Asli recognition, in Thailand around the tiny remaining Manik community, and in India, where the Sentinelese are protected under some of the strictest indigenous protection laws anywhere in the world, with outside contact strictly prohibited. So the next time someone with curly hair in this part of the world gets told their hair must come from somewhere else, from some foreign ancestor nobody can name, there's a real answer now, and it isn't the one anybody expected. That hair isn't an import. It's not Spanish, not Portuguese, not American, not a leftover from colonization. It's older than every one of those historical chapters combined. It walked the southern coastline out of Africa before there were nations, before there were the languages spoken across the region today, before agriculture even existed as an idea. It was already there when the first stone tools were being shaped on the shores of a continent that has since disappeared underwater. It survived ice ages, rising seas, volcanic eruptions, colonization, and the rise and fall of empires, and it's still here, still doing exactly what it always did. One practical note before wrapping up, because a lot of people with curly hair in this part of the world never got useful guidance on how to actually take care of it. Most hair care products and salon norms across the region are built around straight hair as the default, which has left generations of curly-haired individuals hearing that their hair is frizzy, difficult, or unprofessional, and many ended up damaging it through repeated chemical straightening or excessive heat styling. Curly hair simply operates on different rules. It needs more moisture, gentler and less frequent washing, leave-in conditioning, and detangling only while wet, not dry. Many people who've switched to sulfate-free cleansers, started sleeping on satin pillowcases, and stopped brushing dry hair have seen their curl pattern transform within weeks, no chemicals required. Older generations across the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia often understood this instinctively, relying on coconut oil, fresh aloe vera, and traditional plant-based cleansers long before modern hair care ever caught up. The hair was never the problem. The information was just missing. Now it isn't.